October 17th, 1973, Falkville, Alabama. On this show, we often explore stories of visitors from beyond the stars. Stories of aliens and crafts, unlike anything that we've ever heard or seen of before, that leave us scratching our heads and wanting to know more about the universe and whether or not we are truly alone. On one October evening in 1973, small-town police chief Jeff Greenhaw would find his own answer to the question. Or so we think. Jeff would come face to face with a visitor from outer space, but not like the ones we are used to. Looking like a character straight out of a Marvel comic book and with a name to match, this entity appeared and disappeared in a shroud of mystery. However, Jeff was able to get photographs of this mysterious figure, shrouded in a suit of shiny chrome-like metal. What did Jeff capture on photograph that night in Falkville, Alabama in 1973? Is this some type of hoax? Could this be some type of prank pulled on the police chief? And do we have any documented sightings of more of these metal men? Today on Unblurring the Unknown, the Metal Man of Falkville. Welcome back to Unblurring the Unknown. As always, I am your host, Dominic, and today on the show, we are diving into a topic that I had on my episode queue pretty much since the very beginning of the show. And I really have put it off for quite some time, just because it was one that I had already looked into, and some other people had, some other people had done some videos, some content on it as well, so I was like, maybe I'll wait. And unfortunately, it got pushed back and back and back again until now. I haven't also done an alien UFO topic for a couple weeks now, and I felt like it would be a good time to take this one out of the archives, so to speak, and cover it for this week's episode. Now, I'm going to lump in another case that is very similar to the Metal Man of Falkville within this episode. However, I'm just going to brush over it so I can save it fully for another episode down the road. So, I kind of thought about doing a dual topic episode, but I decided against it. With all that being said, how today's episode is going to go is that I'm going to explain to you all where Falkville, Alabama is, because I certainly didn't know where the fuck it was until I researched it. We will go into the story and encounter that Jeff Greenhaw had that October night, the subsequent fallout from that sighting, go into my other sighting of a possible extraterrestrial that happens to be very similar in its metallic silverish appearance, and then wrap it all up with my own personal thoughts and possible theories on what could have happened that night in Falkville. But with that being said, let's get into the meat and potatoes part of the episode, shall we? Now, Falkville, Alabama is an extremely small town located towards the top of the state of Alabama. It resides in Morgan County and was first incorporated in 1876. To be honest, it really doesn't seem like this very small town has many defining characteristics other than its history with the L&N Railroad in the 1870s and two tornadoes that swept through the town in the 1950s. According to the 2020 census, the town only has a population of 1,197 people, which is very, very small. And you have to imagine that during 1973, when our story takes place, that it was even smaller than that. It most likely has that very small town feel where everyone knows everyone, and that is very easy for word to travel fast, especially in little rural towns such as this one. Now, our story begins on October 17th, 1973, and with 26-year-old police chief Jeff Greenhaw. Now, you might be thinking that that's pretty young for a police chief, and you would be right. However, when you are in a local and rural small town, very often the police force is extremely small, and it wouldn't be a shocker for the town of Falkville to only have a couple officers in the entire force, so that makes sense in the idea of a younger police chief such as Jeff, quite possibly could have been the one with the most experience on the force as well, was kind of really the only man for the job in an area such as this one. Now late that evening, Jeff was relaxing at his Falkville home with his wife when the phone rang. When he answered their house phone, a woman was on the other end of the line and she was hysterical. On the other end of the line, she was saying that she had just witnessed something incredibly bizarre that she could not explain. She stated that she had just witnessed the landing of a strange, unidentified aircraft that she could not explain in a field outside of the town limits. That field just happened to be owned by a man named Bobby Summerford. Now, of course, this in and of itself was extremely strange, and Jeff didn't really know what to make of it, or whether or not this caller was telling the truth about what she saw, or even if he should take this call seriously. Nonetheless, Jeff tried to calm her down about the whole incident she just witnessed. Now, of course, Jeff, even though he was off duty at the time the phone call came in, agreed to help the woman and that he would go investigate the area to see if he could find anything that she was talking about. Now, Jeff was hesitant to do so, but this woman sounded genuine to him, and of course any police officer's job is to serve and protect. That kind of would automatically kick in a circumstance such as this one, and it certainly did in the case of Jeff, and he collected his things, said goodbye to his wife, got into his police truck, and headed out to the scene where this woman had reported to have seen this mysterious aircraft landing. Now, it is important to note that the woman on the other end of the line never gave out her name or any other identifiable information, and that remains a question mark in this case from what I could find. Now, no one has come forward claiming responsibility for that phone call to this day. Now, Jeff, also on his way to the scene, called back to the police station and alerted the officer on duty of his intentions to go and investigate this call. When he finally made it to the field, Jeff spent about 15 to 20 minutes driving around the roads, kind of around this large field. And from my understanding and through my research, it seemed like there was a bunch of little roads that were kind of all through this field, and this field was massive. So we spent around 15 to 20 minutes just driving around trying to see anything out of the ordinary, but he didn't find a thing, and he didn't see anything. Jeff thought for sure that this was some sort of prank, and that he had been sent out on some wild chase out in the middle of nowhere very late at night. Jeff decided to head back home, and if I was in his shoes, I would think the exact same thing. You know, I'd get a chuckle, I'd be like, hey, haha, you got me, by kind of driving me out into the middle of the dead of the night for some sort of wild goose chase about some strange aircraft, and joke's on you, and that's kind of what I have to imagine that Jeff was thinking in these moments. However, he would see something that night, even though it was no spaceship. Now, when Jeff decided it was time to leave the field and make it out of the maze of roads that went in and out, and he made it back to the main field road, he saw a figure standing in front of him that was slightly illuminated by his headlights. Now, he didn't have a good look. He just knew someone was standing there. Now, initially, Jeff thought perhaps this was the owner of the field, Bobby Summerford, standing there wanting to perhaps give a statement to Jeff about maybe the woman, or maybe this strange aircraft she thought she saw, or maybe even perhaps he had seen it as well. However, that wasn't the case. Jeff maneuvered his truck so that his headlights fully exposed who was standing in front of him. When he did this, it definitely wasn't Summerford waiting for him in the road. What stood in front of his truck was a humanoid figure standing 4 to 6 feet tall, and the reason I say 4 to 6 foot, and that seems very kind of wide, is because I found kind of conflicting reports on height, with one source claiming the figure was smaller, and then in a later interview done with Jeff, he said that it looked closer more to 6 foot. So that seems to be a little bit of a gray area depending on what source you look into. If anybody else has done research on this topic as well and you found maybe a more defined answer on that, please feel free to share that with me through Instagram direct message or throw it down in the comments. I do check out the comments, so if you do that, I will read it. But back to the story. Now, he also said this figure had a very unusual stride when it tried to walk, and it was covered head to toe in some type of loose-fitting metal coveralls or a suit of some sort with a helmet integrated into it. Like, you couldn't kind of see where the suit started and the helmet ended. Kind of like if you look at like a metallic fire suit, that's kind of how it looked like it was all one piece. Now, the figure also looked to have had a metal antenna sticking up from out of the helmet, similar to the type of antenna you might see on a radio or an RC car. Jeff was quoted the following about the figure's appearance. My initial thoughts were maybe aluminum foil, but there were no pieces around there after it was all over. I don't know what to believe at that point. He continued and said, it looked like his head and neck were kind of made together. He was real bright, something like rubbing mercury on nickel, but just as smooth as glass. Different angles give different lighting. End quote. The suit material was extremely shiny and reflected a lot of the light being shined from Jeff's headlights in his truck. Jeff goes on to say this about the figure as well, and I quote, Whenever I think about it, when I was a child, I used to watch the movie Lost in Space. The robot in the movie, it kind of reminded me of that to some extent. Close quote. At this point, Jeff decided to reach into his truck's glove box and grabbed his Polaroid camera. The figure made no sudden movements and seemed almost peaceful in nature. Now, of course, I am not in the position of Jeff, or in his brain thinking about what this possibly could be standing in front of me. But I would most certainly be confused as to this would be the last thing I would expect to see on the highway or in this labyrinth of farm roads and backcountry fields in the middle of the night. However, at this point, Jeff would decide to exit his vehicle, another thing I probably wouldn't have done, but I also haven't seen aliens before either. Jeff slowly approached this figure with the camera in his hands. He called out a friendly hello, and the figure did not respond. Jeff recalls this part of the incident with the following, and I quote, "I said something to the effect of howdy, stranger, and there was no response at all. I didn't push my luck. At that point, I reached in and turned the blue lights on the patrol car and seen how reflective the material really was. Then, when I looked back, it was moving away from me, so I decided to chase it down. If I have to, run over it. That didn't happen either." Close quote. Now, Jeff would raise the camera and he would take 4 pictures of the figure. Now, at this point, it continued to stand there, and as the 4th picture processed from the camera, the figure turned around and started to run away from Jeff. This is when Jeff really took note of how the figure was moving. He described its movements as very labored and awkward and almost robotic-like. Now, during this moment, you would say that would be maybe when flight or fight would kick in for the average person, and as the figure started running away, Jeff would kick rather into fight mode and jump back into his patrol truck and speed off after the mysterious metallic man. Not knowing what this figure was, he had to shake off any confusion or skepticism he had at this moment and figure out what this figure was and whether or not this was some type of prankster or maybe something else entirely. Now, this is when things get more interesting. As Jeff pursued the entity, he made it back onto the main highway, headed towards the neighboring town of Lakin, when he would spot the figure still running down the road. However, the metal man was traveling at speeds he could not fathom and faster than any normal human could go. Jeff reported that the figure was traveling from anywhere to 35 to 40 miles an hour and that each one of its strides covered almost 10 feet. Jeff said this about the figure's movement, and I quote, "It wasn't moving like you or I would move. It's like it had springs on its feet or something." Close quote. Along with this, the metal man was making a series of leaps and bounds as it would veer from side to side along the roadway and jump incredible distances in the air, perhaps trying to shake Jeff's pursuit. As Jeff swerved his truck from side to side to try and keep the figure in the headlights of his truck, he lost control, and his truck skittered and slid off the road and into a field next to the main highway. As Jeff composed himself and got his truck out of the field and back onto the road, the metal man would have seemingly disappeared into the night, with no trace of its presence being left behind. Of course, in fact, if this story did truly happen, it would be a remarkable experience that would be tough to believe if you told just anybody. And for a bit, Jeff didn't tell anyone about what happened that night, and when Jeff made it back home, he was extremely reluctant to share this sighting and experience with his wife, and rightfully so. However, after some convincing, she told him that he should come forward with what happened that night to the other officers at the police station. And when he did, the reactions weren't great. He was immediately met with ridicule of all sorts, with the officers not believing any of what had happened to him that night. With them and thinking that this must have been some sort of prank, the officers speculated anything. Maybe this was a kid wearing some type of modified Halloween costume to, prank the cops. This wasn't actually aliens. Now, and that was kind of everything that was going around, that this was some type of hoax. This was a real, Jeff, you're crazy. You didn't actually see an alien. And the odds weren't in Jeff's favor. And quite honestly, this is just another example in which witnesses to possible extraterrestrial events don't come forward until years later, or even don't come forward at all, because of the possible ridicule from their family, friends, and even in this case, their coworkers. And later, as we find out in this story, even the town and the media. Now, with the cops clearly not believing him, you would think Jeff might be able to get some sort of relief when the general public found out about this, right? Someone ought to believe him. What about the pictures? Now, when the story hit the media in town, in the pictures for that matter, there was really only one photo that fully showed the entirety of the figure, as the rest really didn't show anything more than kind of a shiny, reflective mass, and you couldn't make out many details about the figure's appearance. And of course, you had that one good photo, and I will hope to attach that photo to my Instagram when this episode does come out, so you can kind of see what I'm talking about. But if you just Google Metal Man of Falkville, the picture comes right up. That is the most clear picture. I don't know if I've seen the rest of the four, but there was really only one good picture. Now, again, you couldn't make out any details about the figure's appearance, and many people thought for sure that this was a hoax, and that this just looked like somebody in some sort of protective fire suit standing in the road, and that Jeff was using the story for publicity or fame. However, I will kind of dive into that a little bit later, but this next kind of turn of events really kind of takes it to a level in which it didn't need to go. Jeff was then subsequently and relentlessly ridiculed by the residents of Falkville. He even had his truck vandalized, and according to one source I found, his house was even set on fire. Now, it is kind of uncertain whether or not these events directly correlate with his Metal Man sighting, but it has to, given the proximity to the sighting and then the subsequent things afterwards. And this whole small town thing I kind of touched on in the beginning worked against Jeff, as everyone really didn't believe him. And because of that, Jeff became an outsider and much of a loner. He didn't do next to any interviews on the events of October 17th up to this point, and why should he, quite frankly? And the whole events that followed the sighting really kind of shows how cruel some people could be, and as I will later discuss in theories, what was the motive behind setting fire to his house or vandalizing his truck? It didn't make any sense regardless of how much you did or didn't believe his story. It didn't make any sense. People are just plain assholes. Now, because of this entire incident, Jeff Greenhaw was summoned to a public meeting with the town council, the county sheriff, and the town mayor, both of which, being the mayor and the county sheriff, refused to support Jeff any further, pretty much backing him into a corner in which Jeff would give his resignation from the Falkville Police Department. However, Jeff claims that after the incident, someone actually broke into his home and stole the pictures. Now, they also happened to steal his service revolver and shotgun that he was able to keep after he gave his resignation. Now, it is unclear whether the break-in was related to the incident, but I don't think it's a coincidence due to the amount of ridicule he faced. And to top it all off, the photos were hidden away in his home because of the media drama he created. So Jeff almost hid them away with the idea that he didn't want just anyone finding them or anyone just stumbling upon them. So I find it very fascinating that they were stolen from his home, and it almost seemed like that his gun, his service revolver, and his shotgun were kind of the intended theft targets because there was other more valuable items within his home that were left untouched. Needless to say, it is very interesting. But with the vandalism and arson of his home, breaking in and stealing things, that does not surprise me. I think it takes another level of kind of assholery. I know that's not a word, but that's the only thing I can think of right now. To do those kind of things to someone who says that they thought they saw something. And again, I touched on it before, but it just goes to show you why some of these people who encounter extraterrestrial events or even things that they might not fully explain never come forward because people get ridiculed. And in the case of Jeff Greenlaw, his personal property gets destroyed. So again, kind of adds fuel to the fire for this whole case. No pun intended with the arson about it. But this whole entire thing would still get worse because due to the constant public ridicule and losing his job and his house being lit on fire, his wife would leave him and file for divorce. Now, talk about kicking a man while he was down, but no worries, as Jeff would go on to remarry. Now, in the years that followed the Metal Man incident, Jeff did agree to do some interviews, but they were very far and few between, and he never sought any financial compensation from these, which again, gives him credibility. We have covered a lot of UFO cases so far on the show, and in my opinion, the second someone tries to reach for the money bag, in my opinion, it knocks so much credibility out the window. Now, another interesting tidbit in terms of the authenticity of the event was that Jeff actually sent the photos, before they were stolen, to MUFON, which, if you've not heard of MUFON before, and if you're unfamiliar with it, is an acronym that stands for the Mutual UFO Network. Now, he sent the photos to MUFON for analysis and to hopefully get a type of vindication that this was in fact an extraterrestrial visitor, or at least, I have to imagine that was his thinking. Now, MUFON did get back to Jeff and was convinced that it was most likely a hoax too, and they sent the pictures back. But they did say the images were not doctored in any way and that they were genuine after being examined by image analysis experts. Now, skeptics are quick to latch onto the idea that this entire thing was a hoax for the obvious reasons we discussed earlier, but also because it seemed kind of quote-unquote convenient that Jeff had a camera with him that night, and to be honest with you, that might be true. But let me debunk that real quick. Police need cameras all the time to take photos of crime scenes and evidence. So the idea that a cop would keep a camera in his patrol vehicle makes sense. That is not some outlandish idea. I think people who come out to that and say, oh, why did he conveniently have a camera to conveniently take a picture of the alien that was conveniently standing right in front of his pickup truck? It would make sense for a cop to have a camera, especially in the 1970s in a very rural town with probably a small police force. It was probably wise to carry a camera because you don't know what you're going to come across, and you probably got to take pictures for evidence and crime scenes like I just mentioned. So that is not, again, this bewildered idea, or at least not in my opinion. Now, lastly, before we move into our little last bit of facts, before moving into theories, what makes the case of the Metal Man of Falkville more compelling is perhaps not the encounter itself, but also the string of alien encounters that have happened with very similar metallic and robotic entities. Some of which, for example, include the Pascagoula incident, which I covered very recently on another episode, where the aliens are very robotic and silverish in nature. Another one being the Silver Man of Risley, which I'll briefly go over here in just a little minute. The Cisco Grove encounter, which, again, another one for the possible episode queue that I have going on in the notes section of my phone. And then you also have the Voronezh sighting in the Soviet Union and Russia, which, again, in the 1970s, I believe, again. So they're all relatively close to each other, and all of these sightings expressly involve the appearance of robotic-like entities, either coming out of spaceships or kind of accompanying your kind of standard-looking alien. Now, it's very important to note that this type of encounter is not as uncommon as you might think it is, and I want to touch on one of those encounters that I just mentioned, in the Silver Man of Risley. Now, the Silver Man of Risley is another extraterrestrial encounter that I can do a whole episode on, like I just said, but I want to give you a quick synopsis of this event and the similarities it has with what Jeff Greenhaw saw in Falkville. In Risley, United Kingdom, on March 17, 1978, 39-year-old service engineer Ken Edwards was driving home after having a meeting in Manchester, United Kingdom. As he traversed the road home, he approached a nearby atomic energy plant when he was stopped dead in his tracks by a mysterious figure moving down a hill next to the road and towards the atomic energy plant. What Ken witnessed, and what he goes on to describe, was roughly a 7-foot-tall figure that was all metallic silver in color with an all-black face and having no discernible facial features other than a pair of glowing eyes. Ken goes on to say that the figure also had long, thin arms, but they were attached at what we would normally think of as shoulders, but rather stuck straight out from its chest, kind of like how a T-Rex arms would. Kind of a weird visual, if you ask me. Now, Ken noted that the figure's posture was extremely strange and that no human would be able to replicate it, and that would later be confirmed by investigators trying to replicate it later on and failing, according to Ken's account. Now, the Silver Man was walking also very robotic, and its gait looked as if it didn't have any knee joints, and that its movements were also very robotic, stiff, and kind of just, it didn't look right. It didn't look human. And during this encounter, as the figure crossed the road in front of Ken, The figure had a set of thin, laser beam-like lights emit from its eyes and make contact with Ken as he sat in his car. Ken reported the feeling of being paralyzed, and a dizzy feeling overcame him, and he lost his sense of time. Shortly after what seemed like a small window of time had collapsed, he regained control of his muscles and noticed his fingers were intensely throbbing and looked sunburnt. The rest of the encounter involved the Silver Man being able to seemingly pass through a barbed wire fence opposite of the atomic energy facility and traverse a hill beside a fire station across the street from the plant, and then subsequently disappear into the woods to never be seen again. Now, this is an extremely compelling case that bears a lot of similarities with other alien encounters, such as the burning on Ken's hands and the feeling of lost time. However, even though there are differences, the similarities between the Falkville case and the Risley United Kingdom Silverman are pretty compelling to say the least. So, where does that leave us? I think it is finally time to dive into some possible theories about what Jeff Greenhaw saw that night in Falkville, Alabama. Now, our first theory is that this was a real extraterrestrial. Now, this was an extraterrestrial visitor, possibly from the UFO witnessed by the woman who frantically called Jeff in the middle of the night. Now, of course, Jeff never saw the UFO that night, and from what I could find, no one else did either, which is the doubtful part of this. However, if in fact the figure's movements were real from the speed the metal man was running, and the darting and leaping around the road clearly seemed non-human. However, what makes me doubt this is a couple different things here. Number one being the photo that Jeff Greenhaw took clearly shows a figure. There's no doubt in my mind it clearly shows a figure, whether that's a human, whether that's an alien, it shows something. But the alien part is questionable because you do not see any, typical alien features of what you would normally kind of associate with aliens. And as somebody who has done quite a little bit of research on UFOs and aliens, I'm no expert by any means, you just do not see those features in the picture. Call me a pessimist, call me a skeptic. You just don't see that in the picture. Now, number two being Jeff was the only one to see it. There was nobody else there in the area who reported to have seen the metal man. There was no one else in the area who said they saw, lights or a craft landing in Bobby Summerford's field. You didn't see that. And number three, no evidence was left behind at the scene to show that something was there. That's, of course, the big one. You always look for evidence. Of course, UFO cases in particular, it is very kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? Evidence is hard to come by in UFO cases, but you can look back at Ken Edwards in the Silverman of Risley case. His hands got sunburnt, and he said that there was sunburnt there. That's evidence. Something happened to cause his hands to get sunburnt, or what looked to be sunburned. So you have that, and that's kind of a little piece of evidence. There is nothing to show that Jeff was, there, and that there was somebody that was there with him, whether it be a alien, whether that be a prankster, whether anything like that. And we don't even know if there's any pictures out there of Jeff's truck after he ran it off the road. Like if there was some damage to the truck after he ran it off the road, that would maybe support the idea that he saw something that night. But again, that could happen from a variety of reasons, not that he was chasing some metal alien that was kind of leaping through the sky. So again, call me a skeptic or whatever you want. those are the three glaring issues for me that I see when I initially take a look at the idea that this is a real case. Now, our second theory is kind of a little bit of a three-parter, and that be fake/prank/stress-induced psychosis. Now, this would start that this is some kind of kid or prankster in some fire suit or Halloween costume trying to play a prank on the cops. After all, this did take place in October, just to throw that out there. Now, it wouldn't explain what Jeff saw, though, and the movements the metal man made on the road, if in fact Jeff did see it in the first place. It is clear someone was there, because we see in that photo that there is a figure, like we just established. But what if instead, after seeing the prankster, Jeff suffered from an episode of stress-induced psychosis, which can cause hallucinations, delusions, and erratic and impulsive behavior that could be responsible for driving his truck off the road. Now, these episodes of stress-induced psychosis would often come with they would come with a lack of self-awareness, as the person going through them would not even realize they are having an episode, and literally anything can trigger them. I am not sure, however, how stressful Jeff was at his job or in his personal life before the incident to have something like this condition. And to top it all off, this condition is pretty rare, only affecting every 15 to about 100 people out of every 100,000, according to the National Institute of Mental Health. Although a lot of things would have to go right for this theory to work, I kind of like it. This would explain the movements of the prankster, even though in real life they were just running away. The hallucinations from the stress would cause Jeff to see that this figure was all over the place and going through the sky when that just was not happening. That, or maybe Jeff was drunk and seeing things. But who knows? Even though, as a police officer, I kind of doubt he was drunk. Now, our last little theory here is called kicked out of town. And I saw this theory on Reddit, and I kind of liked it, even though there were some holes in it. Now, a Redditor proposed that maybe, in fact, somebody wanted Jeff out of town for a variety of reasons. Maybe they wanted him to resign from his position of police chief, so they faked this phone call, which would work, because again, the woman never gave out any personal information, and lured Jeff out there and staged the prank. However, we go back to, I don't know about the erratic movements the Metal Man did on the road, or how they pulled that off, or maybe that was a product of the hallucinations, and perhaps maybe the powers that be really wanted to get him out of town by vandalizing his truck and setting his house on fire to maybe send a message for him to leave. And when both of these didn't work, it was then up for them to kick him out the old-fashioned way through the town government. Now, I don't know about this one, and parts of it I kind of like. However, I couldn't see a reason as to why such a small town would hold a grievance against someone who was seemingly, by all accounts that I could find, normal. Now, my own personal thoughts on this is that I'm kind of stumped. I find it hard to believe as if it was just Jeff who kind of saw it. However, you wouldn't think, or at least you wouldn't think, that he would drive his truck off the road on purpose for the hoax. You wouldn't think that he would manufacture this public ridicule. You wouldn't think that he would deliberately have his truck vandalized. You wouldn't think that he would set his own house on fire. And of course, his wife left him. You wouldn't think this would all be for some elaborate prank, even if the prank did go a little too far. That almost seems way too far. To be honest, I think this encounter was true, to a fault. I think Jeff definitely saw something that night, but what it was perhaps will always remain a mystery. However, what we do have is perhaps one of the more interesting and compelling photos of a supposed extraterrestrial visitor that we have ever had. And whether it was true or make-believe, the whole thing makes for a damn good story. But with that being said, that is the entire story of the Metal Man of Falkville. I hope you really enjoyed this episode. Again, this one was in the queue for a very long time, and I needed to do it justice by digging it out of the archive, so to speak, and putting it up for this week's episode. But again, I hope you all enjoyed it. Now, since it is the end of the episode, of course, I'm going to do my obligatory plugs I do at the very end. That being said, if you were listening to this on YouTube, please like, comment, subscribe. It helps me out with the algorithm gods, and I greatly appreciate it. If you listen to this on Spotify, please turn on post notifications so you get notified every time I drop a new episode. It should be on Tuesdays. Of course, a couple weeks ago, I was a little slacker. I didn't drop an episode one week because I was actually off on family vacation, so I did not drop an episode that week. I do apologize, but it should be every Tuesday. You will get those new episodes. Of course, I am also on TikTok at Unblurring the Unknown, where I'll be posting 1-minute breakdowns of the episodes that I post, so please go check me out there. And if you have any topic suggestions, I do take topic suggestions. You can send them to me through Instagram direct message or to my email at unblurringtheunknown@gmail.com. But with that being said, that is going to conclude this week's episode on the Metal Man of Falkville, and I will see you all on the next one.